All right, everybody, welcome back to the Rutgers Rant. Politi here. We're all here. Very exciting, fellas. As I was asking questions about what we should talk about on this podcast, the number one topic that people want to talk about is not basketball. So in the spirit of that, we have two choices. We can talk about football to start, or we could talk about the best team at Rutgers right now. Which team is that? Brian, you know what the best team at Rutgers is right now.
The only team, as far as I can remember, in the winter season to make it to the NCAAs. Your Rutgers women's gymnastics team, as everyone predicted, would come out and break an 11-year drought and make it to NCAA regionals.
How about that? Can you imagine? Let me just think about that for a minute. All the crap that happened this fall with that program, with the head coach, with Pat Hobbs, with the saga, and that's the team still standing in the NCAA tournament. You can't make this crap up. I love it. You were there too, right? You saw this. I love when Brian walks into a gymnastics media availability now. It's exciting.
It wasn't quite the locker room in Indianapolis where all 15 guys, stared blankly at me, but it was about, 25 girls kind of noticing me standing in the corner, kind of eyeing me like, is that him? And some interesting interactions from, the basketball story we wrote last week, which we'll go over later on. But it was fun in that, they're in the men's basketball film room and an assistant coach is kind of reading her journal entry from the Friday morning before the Big Ten championships, where she kind of manifested that they would make it to the regionals. They did. And then they get their name called on ESPNU and then place goes nuts. And it was, again, for a tumultuous, turbulent season, a year that started with their coach being investigated and ultimately put on administrative leave. It's a nice little story. Just to be clear, for people that don't follow gymnastics, it's almost impossible not to make NCAA regionals. There were 3 high major teams that didn't make NCAA regionals. Iowa State, Pitt, and Washington was the only Big Ten team not to do it, and the only Big Ten team Rutgers beat this season. But it's been 11 years. It's been 11 years. They broke through, and you know what? They want to make this a yearly tradition. No more 11-year droughts. Every year you want to see the Rutgers Scarlet Knights. And just to kind of wrap this up, in a poetic matchup, their first NCAA regional matchup in 11 years is against Clemson, the same team Rutgers basketball played its first NCAA tournament game in 30 years. That was in Indianapolis. This one is in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. How about a road trip, fellas?
Synergy. Let's do it. Load into the minivan. Let's go down there. All right, maybe not. All right, while you were over there, you got there too. I guess I can't even say that. Then you met me over at the Hale Center for some football. Spring football is alive. Greg Schiano talking for the first time in about 3 months. Looked great. Optimism. Even he said, though, if you're not optimistic this time of year, you got something really wrong. They don't have something really wrong. They're happy, Pat. They're like, I don't know. You saw what he said. He's kind of cheery about the whole thing.
Right. Well, think about it like this. He's got the quarterback. For how many years of spring football has the story been?
Yes.
Oh, we don't have a quarterback. The quarterback is in place. He really addressed all the changes on the coaching staff. The line that I always kept going back to the last couple of years was that he felt he had the 2 best coordinators in the sport in position. Obviously, Coach Harris-Simiak went to UMass, and that opened up, a hole to fill. Schiano thinks he filled it with 2 great guys. Obviously, like you said, optimistic about everything, the transfer portal, the guys they brought in, returning experience. Good time to be optimistic. We got a long way till it actually counts, but yeah, I thought he looked really good too. Schiano.
And the quote he had was very strong. It was no ifs, ands, or buts. He's our quarterback. I mean, they love Ethan Kelly, man. It's to start. Did I mispronounce his name on the first?
No, you got it.
I nailed it this time.
Yeah.
As soon as I said it, I'm like, I can't believe it. I've had all year to get this right, wrong, and I'm going to Cliff Omori. Get that name right. Harris-Simiak. All my trouble names. But he was a very. Left no doubt about it. Talked about the offense. Brian, you asked him a couple questions about the decision on defensive coordinator. Not surprisingly, didn't answer. I mean, it might be spring football, but he's in mid-season form, folks, with not really getting to the gist of the question, which why would you bring Rob Smith back now after you kind of parted ways with him 2 years ago? His kind of a joke was, well, I've hired him 4 times now, which was a great answer. I don't know. He seems like he's found the mix he likes with the 2 defensive coordinators. I guess you got to trust him on it.
Yeah, look, he referred to it being a long process, and it was. It felt like it dragged on forever.
Yeah.
And look, I think it's no secret that Corey Heatherman was at the top of the board, and he ultimately got the job. Well, first he got an extension, and then he got the job in Miami. That kind of eliminated his possibility. Obviously, that would have been a home run hire. Nothing really they could do about it. And after a winding search, they ran up with a guy that, much like Kirk Straka, Greg is comfortable with, right? And in this age of college sports where you asked him Politi about being a GM and he's worried about agents and contracts and salary cap, and now he has one of his starting players suing the NCAA to be able to play next year. In this modern age where there's so much time spent off the field, he has a guy who he knows can call a defense, can call his defense, and he trusts as far as an X's and O's guys, which in today's age, your coordinators should be purely football X's and O's, preparing the team to play well. And I think, look, for all the faults that Rob Smith has, and clearly there were some if he was not renewed the first time he was here, I think the guy can coach ball and he can coach Greg Schiano's defense. And that gives Greg Schiano some sort of assurance, much like him saying last year he had the two best coordinators in the country. I think he feels good about where the defense is being called. As far as the co-defensive coordinator thing, he explained the situation. I think very clearly that Rob Smith is the coordinator. Greg said he's going to call the plays for, and then Zach Sparber is kind of a rising coach in waiting, right? You give him the title to kind of entice him after some other schools were offering co-defensive coordinator jobs. I believe James Madison, namely. You get him here, you give him the title, you give him a bit of more of a pay bump than he would have gotten otherwise. And he's kind of the protege under Rob Smith, who again is the one leading the way. I would have liked to get more to the meat of why Rob Smith is coming back. Did he actually change? Like, that's possible. I asked Greg that. Like, has he evolved in the 2 years? I guess we'll find out in the fall. But yeah, that's kind of the answer we got.
The other part of this, and you mentioned it briefly about the GM position. I find it interesting because, knowing Greg Schiano, as long as I've known him, covered him, his thing for so many years was if another program has it, he wanted it. Like, it's just kind of like, why should we not have what Penn State has or whoever it might be? And that has served Rutgers well, because it has pushed Rutgers toward the point where it can no longer have any excuses as far as salaries, as far as facilities to some degree, but when it comes to the GM position, he's just in no hurry to make that hire. And I find it interesting. And in a lot of ways, given what's happening around the country, Pat, where like it seems like everybody, like, that's the hot thing. Like, it doesn't matter who you hired or what, it could be a former sports writer. It could be the head of the Shrine Bowl. It could be whatever it is. You're just looking for someone to fill a job. Like, he's comfortable with the operations there.
Right. And I thought his explanation was actually really interesting too. He talked about Eric Josephs being the head of personnel department and doing a great job for him always. And the trust that he has in this philosophy that they no longer just need a high school guys to recruit high school. They need a whole new staff of guys to scout players in college before they enter the transfer portal, because once they enter the transfer portal, it's too late. Like, you need to be ahead of that. So I thought that was a really interesting thing. And it just seems like a GM is a nice thing to have and name, a CEO type guy that can lead that organization. But at the end of the day, Rutgers, it seems like, especially under Schiano, doing a really good job of putting the pieces in place to be ahead of the curve. And right, like, these guys are doing the role of a GM with 5-6 guys, as opposed to just one.
Right. And there'll only be one true GM at Rutgers, Brian. It's Gregory Edward Schiano. Yeah.
I agree with Pat that, like, hiring a GM would be a nice way to check a box and look like you're doing something. But Greg is, uniquely positioned to be probably the best GM this program can have, especially with him leading it. And he did mention that they probably need to bolster that scouting department in the background, right? Like, these college football programs have essentially front offices that you have to be able to have an infrastructure that, to exactly Pat's point, if you wait until the day a kid is in the portal to research him, reach out and have a connection in some way, you're behind the race. You're not going to catch up, right? Like, and obviously money is the great equalizer in some of those races. Rutgers is not in a position where they're going to outbid teams for high quality transfers. They have to win the other way, and that is by being incredibly prepared, right? And I think Greg Schiano understands that. That's the one strength he has, is like, he is seeing a year, 5 years, 10 years in advance. He sees where this thing is going. He has the NFL experience, as you alluded to in your column, Steve. Like, he knows how these things kind of work, and that gives Rutgers an advantage. And again, that goes back to the point of the coordinators. Greg doesn't have to worry so much about the football aspect of being a head coach, because, we do mention that Rutgers pays its coordinators really well relative to the rest of the country, and I think that's why is that you don't pay your head coach as much. You put the emphasis on the football guys that coach the football. That frees up Greg Schiano to do all the other things that make a good football team, getting the players in that the coordinators could work with. So I would be surprised. And also, again, the elephant in the room with all this is that they don't have an AD, a president, or anybody in a higher position that can kind of be there. Not that they have a humongous say in Greg Schiano's football program, but that can kind of be there in making a hire for a general manager, which is that's a high position in the athletic department.
Oh, they have an AD too. His name is Gregory Edward Schiano. I kid. All right. Schiano talked about bringing in 11 transfers this year, the most he's ever brought in. The one that's in the news, Jet Elad, the safety. You asked, it was great to get our first uncomfortable question out of the way about his lawsuit, or I guess, is it a lawsuit? Yeah, his lawsuit.
It's a complaint, which I think is a lawsuit.
Right. Yeah,
I'm not a lawyer, but
it mentions the NIL money he would lose, which was $500,000 if he wasn't approximately $500,000. Which it's funny. We were talking about it like there were some eyebrows like, "Whoa, Rutgers is playing a safety $500,000." My reaction was kind of like, if that number's right, and Greg Schiano's don't believe everything you read. I don't know. It was like it's not crazy money for a starter and a defense. I mean, is it? I don't know. We debated this. This is great because again, we have no idea what people make. But that was my takeaway. It wasn't crazy money. If it's accurate, it's probably a high number. I get it. That's what they would put in the lawsuit because they want to show the damages. So that might be the absolute maximum he could make. I understand all that. I get it. But it was still interesting, and Greg certainly loved your question about it.
Yes. Yeah, so before I go into that, Pat, when you read $500,000 for starting safety, like how did that number hit your ear?
Felt like a lot, but I don't know. I just really
was it
at the end of the day like a lot. It felt like a lot. It felt like a lot, but then now I like think about it.
But it
if you're paying a roster $20 million, that's right in line.
Right. They're not. Yeah, that's the problem. Well, I guess they are paying a roster $20 million, right? It is
here's
that.
Here's the math I did with Politi on our walk to the car. $500,000 for one starter. If that averages out for the rest of the starters, that's 22 starters at $500,000. That's $11 million, right? If you're having, even at the high end, $18 million to work with, that gives you $11 million for 22 guys, and then $6 to $7 million for another 80 guys. That feels
sounds
like
about right. It sounds about right when you put it that way. What sounds about? You're not paying the fourth string tight end the same amount you're paying Ethan. I mean, right?
Right. Well, you're paying Ethan more, right? Well,
yeah. Right.
Anyway, the point with all this is that the crux of the issue is that Jet Elad believed he would be able to be eligible next season because of the Diego Pavia ruling, which allowed him to get an extra year of eligibility because he had one of his years in junior college not to count, right? And once he won that in Tennessee, the NCAA issued a blanket waiver. Jet Elad, had a slightly different situation. He appealed the NCAA to waive his last year of eligibility. They denied the waiver. Rutgers is now suing. Well, first they appealed, and now they're suing. They got an order for show cause. And again, I'm not a lawyer. I could be botching these legal terms, but he got an order for show cause, which essentially means the NCAA has to show cause for why they can enforce their own rules, which is hilarious that we're at this point in college sports where the NCAA has to prove why it can say it's enforcing this rule. He's going to be at spring practice on Friday. He will be able to compete because he got this order to show cause. Unless the NCAA does show cause in their hearing on April 3rd, my understanding is highly unlikely, right? The NCAA is losing battles left and right. They lose more than the Washington Generals. It sounds like Jet Elad will be able to play this season. I would be very surprised if he didn't get the eligibility. On the salary, I think you hit it on the head, Steve, right? Like the word approximately does so much work in that lawsuit. And $500,000 is probably an accentuation to kind of emphasize, they called it a once in a lifetime NIL deal. It's has a lot more power when it's 500,000 versus, let's just say, to put a number out there, 300,000. Right. So Greg Schiano did not tell us what he's making. He did not understandably want to volunteer where it stands in the spectrum in his NIL deals. But I think it's fair to say that 500,000 is at the absolute high end. Maybe that includes a national championship bonus or something to that effect. Listen, Greg Schiano's in midseason form, avoiding questions. I'm in midseason form, asking uncomfortable questions that I know I will not get the answer to.
Right.
But I just can't help myself. I was so curious, and I thought if there's a 1% chance that maybe he's in an off-season stupor and decides to answer the question, it was worth a shot.
Right. Yeah, he was going to pull out an index card. Now, let me see. No, No, it's a little high. Our quarterbacks make 500,000. Defensive linemen 750. I was just going to go through the list. Wouldn't that be great? That would be that. Yeah, would have been something. Didn't happen though, of course.
How about the injury list to start the press conference?
Yes. Well, that's just another attempt to keep to smack the kids, so you guys didn't have to ask those questions.
It's helpful.
What do we make of that list, Pat? There's no one really on it that. I mean, obviously missing some guys for spring sucks, but only one season-ending injury.
Right. Yeah. These are all guys. Right. I forget. Was it DK Gilly? Was the one DK Gilly, rising player who would have been definitely in the mix, is out. But the other guys are mostly all recovering from previous injuries. Sam Brown's, Mo Torres. So veteran guys that you wouldn't really expect to play much in the spring anyway. So good names to hear though, as a reminder, right? Like a guy like Brian Felter is coming back. So interesting.
The only guy that I saw that I would have liked to see in the spring was Shedrick Rhodes. Like, I'm curious to know how much in the mix he's going to be at either tackle spot. That's good to me. We can get into kind of the position battles in the spring. The most interesting thing to me is left tackle to replace Holland Pierce, a guy that we probably all took for granted as far as a stalwart, consistent force on this team for the last 2 years where, the most important position on the field, arguably, aside from quarterback, you had a guy there that you can depend on and be in the upper echelon of the Big Ten. So I'm curious to see who goes there, what ends up happening. Do they end up having to go into the portal for a left tackle, which is a whole other difficult issue to work with when we're speaking about money. And there are other interesting things. I'll have a story tomorrow morning, Wednesday, about kind of 5 things I'm watching, but there are other interesting things in the spring that I'm looking forward to kind of getting a glimpse of.
Yeah, it's amazing. This is the first time we haven't gone into a spring where we're talking quarterback. I mean, it is very interesting. For me, I am interested to see how those new defensive linemen look, how they match up size-wise with Big Ten offensive linemen. I think that's certainly the position that Greg Schiano looked at and said, okay, I need guys here based on what he did. There's really little question about it. The secondary, I'm less worried about. I understand they've lost a bunch of guys there, but that's sort of been Schiano Ball has been able to figure that position out, and I think he will again with young guys if need be. But he has not. I mean, it's harder to address that defensive line. He went out and got guys who you think will be immediate impact players. All the transfers at some level will be immediate impact players, but that position especially, I will be interested just to see that, to eyeball them, right, to see what they look like when they're on the field.
What about you, Pat? What do you?
I thought one of the really interesting things he kind of glossed over. He talked about replacing Kyle Monungai, and I just thought that's like the biggest thing, right? For me is to see how the running back position shakes out. I mean, obviously you won't see it really, and because Sam Brown won't be there, how he factors in what he's able to do coming off 2 injuries now. So, but I think the biggest thing to me is, what does the offense look like knowing that your best player is your quarterback? And what does the offense look like when you're replacing a guy that had 25 average 25 carries a game and was clearly the focal point of the offense. So I think that's the biggest thing for me.
Yeah. The evolution of the offense will be fascinating because you have, Greg mentioned the wide receiving core, right? Ian Strong taking another step after an offseason, KJ Duff, growing into his body and becoming more of a factor. So you have to hope that DT Sheffield can replace the production from Dymere Miller, but on paper, you have one of the best, if not the best, wide receiving core you've had in 10 years, 15 years. Tight end, you have an improvement in Colin Weber on paper again, right? But that position, obviously, as far as an attacking weapon, really can only go up. Kenny Fletcher had a nice stint last year, but really they can get more out of it as a bigger piece of the puzzle. And then CJ Campbell replacing Kyle Monungai. He's not going to be as strong of a runner, I think, between the tackles or kind of beating tackles the way Kyle did. And Greg emphasized the fact that he had never fumbled in his career, right? Like, I don't think you can depend on that to happen again. But what CJ Campbell adds is a really interesting dynamic as a pass catcher, and how Kirk Sharaka is going to implement that into the offense. Is that going to open things up in the playbook and expand, open up the offense in general? I don't think we're going to see that in the spring, to be clear. I don't think we're going to see much in the spring, but that to me is what I'm really interested in, is the evolution of the offense. They had their best year in a decade last year. How do they evolve, not just production wise, but philosophically and how they look. And So
Yeah.
and I agree on the secondary. You can just put any guy there. You can put me at DB, and Schiano could make me a.
Wouldn't go that far, but I do wonder about the running back. It's funny you mentioned that now because it's, are we operating on the assumption that someone's going to step into that job and get the majority of Kyle Monungai's carries, or are we going to do what we see now in the NFL where the teams have 3 running backs and it's running back by committee. Greg Schiano's not done that in his college career. He's relied on one guy, but he's always had the one guy, right? He's always, that's always been sort of the way the program's built. I think you can make an argument now. We haven't seen, the new guy in action, but I mean, there's still some talent in that position. Like, I don't want to, you don't give up on Raymond. Don't give up on Sam Brown. Even though he's hurt in spring. I mean, those guys were pretty talented. So it's interesting to watch that one.
Even Jayshon Benjamin has been great at times too, right? So there are guys there for sure.
Right.
I think you have versatility now, right? Like Kyle was a guy that you depended on for every snap. Now you can get a Kyle Monangai-esque guy in Antoine Raymond. You can get CJ Campbell, who's more of a pass catcher, depending on the matchup you're going against. As far as Sam Brown, I think the cautious way to go about it is anything you get from him next fall is a bonus. He got a pretty bad injury, season-ending injury midway through the year. I think it's hard to expect him to be back at the start of the year. And obviously, if you're working your way back to health during the season, it might be hard to make an impact at all. So I think listen, I could be wrong here, right? But just my sense in the situation is that Sam Brown, anything you get from him next year would be a bonus. And if you can get him back to what he was as a freshman at any point, certainly would be very helpful.
But speaking about like a committee approach, what better way to have a big, strong back like Sam Brown for a 3rd and 1, regular or a short yardage situation? That'd be a perfect role for him, I think, in my mind.
No, good point. All right. So in keeping with the people asking us to hold off on basketball, let's do some questions about football, and then we'll come into. We have to talk about basketball, folks. I'm sorry, it's kind of relevant. All right. So there are some questions about the spring game, which is interesting. I think the trends nationally. What exactly are the rules on 2 schools playing a spring game and or some sort of practice or scrimmage together? And is going to Miami actually something that could happen? We'll explain that in a minute. Next question is turning to is Greg Schiano still committed to the idea of a spring game? We asked that question. We talked about it. Brian, give me your sense on what the future of the spring game. It seems like it's on solid ground despite all the changes in the sport.
It's definitely happening this year. And I believe Greg didn't clarify if it's the same format because some schools are changing their format, not doing a game, doing more of a kind of like a Rutgers Day-esque, like just messing around on the field. I think Rutgers is going to have a traditional spring game. We can confirm with Schiano on Friday. But beyond that, I don't know. I mean, he didn't commit to doing it beyond this year. He said he loved the idea of it. He loves the tradition. But as always, college football evolves and Greg Schiano evolves with it. So as far as the joint practices, Greg was spotted a photo, I believe from 247 or the Miami account. I'm not sure which. Caught him at Miami practice last week. I believe he was just kind of in the area checking it out. Obviously, Crystal Ball is one of his mentees.
On vacation, I think, down in the Florida area and stopped in. That's my guess.
Right. I don't think he was doing Girl Scouting or
TMZ'd.
Exactly. He's getting Taylor Swift at a Coral Gables nightclub.
I don't think if they do a joint practice, which I'll explain a bit, but I don't think they do it with Miami, right? That feels like, you probably would want to do it with like a Temple level team that's 1 closer and 2 not as good. The joint practices started because Deion Sanders, obviously an NFL guy, brought that idea up in a press conference. Fran Brown, ever the social media star, opportunist, smart guy to kind of lightning rod his way into the conversation, tweeted at Deion Sanders that he'd love the idea and he'd go to Boulder. Both schools applied, Syracuse and Colorado, for a waiver from the NCAA. Now they're waiting to hear it. If that happens, which I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if it did, right? Like that kind of opens the floodgate to something like this that coaches have been talking about. I think Greg's been talking about it too. Finally can happen. I think it would be a positive. It would certainly would be more useful than a spring game where you're playing at half speed against the same teammates you've seen for the past 6 months or whatever. So Greg seemed to want to do it at training camp, which I thought was really interesting. I think that brings some risk to injury so close to the season, but you do get up to game speed as the season comes closer. I don't know. I don't know if you guys have any thoughts, but I think it's an interesting conversation to have.
Yeah, I mean, certainly NFL, it's a big deal. I mean, in past years, Giants against Detroit, I think Giants Jets at one point. It's a lot of fun. It certainly breaks up the monotony of it, but you're right. Like, I don't know. I don't know the value there for a program like Rutgers, risking that sort of getting hurt, there's a high risk there. I don't know what the reward matches it, Pat. That's how I kind of feel.
I just think it's going to be something that 10 years from now, fans are going to complain like, why no one's going to play? Why are we doing this? It'll basically become what the one preseason game has become in the NFL, right? Like this completely,
right.
well, but then at the end of the day, I guess that is what the spring game is in itself too. So, one hand in the other one, same as what we got now, but it's like not solving a problem. It's just moving a piece to the left.
Yeah.
I think like the NFL, the practices would be more valuable. Like the joint practices are what matters. The spring game, the preseason games are always just like window dressing, right? Or it's to get fans out and to spend some money on beer and hot dogs or whatever.
Right.
So yeah, I don't know, but I think it's another example of college football just moving towards that professional model. I think to your point, Pat, 10, 15 years, we're going to look at college football as a minor league of the NFL, almost a mirror of it.
Right. All right. Question from Mark Berger on the Twitter. What are the expectations for the football team heading into 2025? Monster-like or tepid given the schedule? I think we saw our first hint of how Greg Schiano is going to handle these questions throughout the spring, throughout the summer. And we're still 6 months away from actual meaningful football, and it's going to be to talk about the schedule. He mentioned it right off the bat here when I asked him. I'm, just kind of threw a softball at him here at the end of this press conference. I'm like, "Yeah, you seem like you're in a good mood. What are the reasons for optimism?" And he immediately took it back to the schedule. Like this is the schedule we play, the Big Ten. It's good, But we're excited. We're ready. We're ready to go. We like our team. We like our players. We like our coaches. I love Rutgers University, but the schedule. I think that's going to be. And he's right. Look, I think if you look at it, there's a chance that Rutgers could be better than last year and have the same record. Or worse if things don't break their way. I mean, that is certainly a possibility for this team when you look at the schedule.
Totally agree. And right, like Rutgers plays in the margins, and it's all about the three close games that are going to go one way or the other. And you can't expect them to win them all. You can't expect them to lose it all. Whatever the way it breaks is how this season's going to unfold in my mind.
Right.
This is the opposite of last season, where last season was an easy schedule full of 50-50 games. And we thought in the preseason, on the high end, if all broke well, Rutgers would have a 9-win, 10-win season. I think obviously there's no illusions of a 9-win season. I totally agree with your hypothesis. I think that's going to be the popular hypothesis going into the year. This could be a better team that wins less games, right? Because the schedule is harder. To me, and I'll keep saying this in the off season, more than the amount of wins they get, I think making it to a bowl game ultimately is the goal this season, because I think that's the realistic goal, right? Like winning enough games to make a bowl game. But the more important thing to me, even more important than making a bowl game, is they beat a good team, a ranked team, a high-end team. You have two chances with Oregon and Ohio State and a couple of other good teams on the schedule. I'm not saying they have to beat Oregon and Ohio State for it to be a successful season, but we are at the point, the streak is so long, and this team is 5 years into Greg Schiano's tenure. They have a lot of talent. They are at a point where they should at least, in one of these games, go midway through the fourth quarter, and people are tuning into the Big Ten Network. Ohio State, Oregon, Penn State, whoever is on upset alert against Rutgers, and finally break through. I think that's the one wall, glass ceiling, whatever you want to call it, that this program has been bashing its head against for years now, that if they finally break through with that, then you're talking about a whole other level of this program.
Yeah. Some 7-6s are better than other 7-6s. Yeah, put it that way. Yeah.
Well, I would say what would you take a 7-5 with no elite win? Right, let's say you beat all the teams you should, and you get one decent win over, let's say, in Illinois last year, or you go 5-7, but one of those wins is at Ohio State.
No, you got Oregon. If you said 6-6, I might have agreed with that, but you got to give me above 500 record. You can't not do a bowl game. Yeah, for me, I would take the 7-5 with because you'd still have with this schedule, you still have a couple of good wins to get the 7 wins in the regular season, right? I mean, it's still.
Yeah, and
disagree?
No, I agree. And because you can sell a winning record always. This is it's still all about, for Schiano, this upward trajectory, and they're still building. The pipeline is still expanding. We'll see in a little bit with the NFL draft coming up. I think that's the selling point of this program, that like if we hang on long enough and all these things break our way, we'll finally be there. And the day that you lose that hope, going 4-8 is like a real slap in the face to the people that are believing in, all right, we're there, right? We're at least at this stable position of being at least 500.
I agree.
Especially when you're playing a non-conference schedule that, right, you should win 3 games every year, no matter what, right? They're not going to go out and schedule a Iowa State, right?
Right.
No doubt. I understand where you guys are coming from. I think it's totally a valid way to look. To me, I think beating a big team and becoming a national story for a week is so much more valuable long-term than going to the Pinstripe Bowl again, right? I think of Vanderbilt's season. I don't remember what their record was. I really don't. I don't even know if they played in a bowl game. I know they beat Alabama.
Yeah.
I remember that. And the sense to me is that Vanderbilt is on an upward trajectory. I don't follow Vanderbilt. I don't know much about Vanderbilt. But the little I do is that they beat Alabama, and I feel like they're doing better because of that. The fans got a memory, right? Ultimately, let's be real here, right? Rutgers is a program that is almost never going to be in a position to fight for a national championship, right? And the fun in being a fan of these teams is wins and memories and moments, right? I think if you give these fans one more moment like that, not quite Louisville, but a moment, I think that is so valuable for the fan base, for recruiting, for the feeling around the program, then again, going to the Rate Bowl or going to even Music City or, the Mayo Bowl, whatever. Like, that's all nice and good. I think the other things are more fun.
I tell you what, fans might sign with it. If you're talking November 29th and that win is against Penn State that knocks them out of the playoff, they might sign for that. What you described here, that you make some, but man, they'd be 4-7 at I'm sorry, they'd be 4-7 at that point. So you would say you'd be okay with that. In your scenario, Rutgers would be 4-7. They'd beat Penn State in the final game. And you think that would be a positive. It'd be a rough slog to get there. That's a lot of L's.
Well, the opposite would be they're 6-5 and they get smacked around by Penn State again, lose 37.
No, they'd be 7-4 and they get smacked around by Penn State because they'd go 7-5 in my description of this.
Correct. All right, fair enough. They'd be 7-4 and they get smacked around by Penn State.
Yeah, so they won the 3-0. It's tough. It's tricky. I still think
good debate. Good debate.
Yeah, good debate.
I would be interested to hear. We'll put this on our Discord. I'd be interested to hear what fans think because I think it's the way you look at this. I think kind of is a reflection, a mirror, if you will, of how you view the sport, how you view the program, how you view success.
Mirror into your soul. All right, good transition. So to talk basketball, let's just answer the questions here because I think the questions people have about basketball, the stuff we're going to talk about. This one I really wanted to address because I think it kind of nails down into your obit story, Brian. Compare and contrast how Pikel and Schiano have adopted to the evolving college sports landscape, i.e. NIL. And I think it's interesting because if you haven't read Brian's 4,000 word what went wrong story on this season, I really suggest you do it because I think there's just a lot of nuggets, background information in there. It really puts it in perspective as to what happened here. And to me, the thing that sticks out and the thing that's been rolling around in my brain about this as I kind of look back on this season entirely, it's that it was lost long before like Dylan Harper and Ace Bailey got here. Right. And that to me is what kind of makes it even a little worse in a lot of ways. And I think I'm stuck with the idea that the Rutgers had a head basketball coach in order to try to pay for a roster. The stuff that Steve Pikel was doing in those last few years, months before this happened, selling whiskey at a liquor store with Geo Baker, doing a Top Golf event and glad handing fans for just stuff where what is the coach going to make in these scenarios? Like what are you talking about? A few $100 here? To try to get any cash at all for an NIL budget where you need hundreds of thousands of dollars, not hundreds of dollars, right? Like that to me, that sticks out to me. And to the question here, compare and contrast, I really do think Greg Schiano recognized what it was going to be immediately. Recognized immediately that he was not going to get help from the athletic director and was going to have to do this alone. Like those were two things he on day one. He recognized that he couldn't. This is it. This is the game. This is the sport. I don't like it. It doesn't matter. How am I gonna respond to it? And I think he was really aggressive for it. I think it was slower to respond to that in the basketball side. I'm not saying that Steve Pikel didn't recognize he was going to have it. You have that great scene where he's like, yeah, we can't be last, Pat. We can't be last. But it was just like a different approach to it. And Greg was more wired to handle it.
Yep. And maybe that's like the product of the sport too. in the grand scheme of things, like, why do Cinderellas exist in the NCAA, or why did they exist in the NCAA tournament? You could win with 5 guys and this great idea of team concept and building and getting the most out of your team. And certainly you can do that in football too, to a certain extent. But look at who won the national championship this year, the team that spent the most money, right? What has been happening in college football has always kind of been there. Right. And I think maybe to a certain, I mean, obviously, clearly you can go through many examples of that existing in basketball as well. I'm not saying that there weren't schools that were towing the line in basketball. Obviously, there have been. But just look at Rick Pitino to be a perfect example. But the point I'm trying to make, I think Schiano was just always ahead of the curve, and understood it from the other perspective too, because think about where he came from, right? Ohio State was so far ahead of this too. He was there during all these conversations, knew what was coming down the pipe, whereas Pikiell was just kind of going down the road and trying to be the best version of himself.
There's a lot to blame to go around. A lot. There's no one person that we could point and pin this to and say it's this person's fault. If they had done this better, this would have been better. It all starts, to be completely fair, that Rutgers has a donor base that has, for the past decade since it's been in the Big Ten, donated less money to the athletic department than any other Power 5 team. This is for the school's athletic department. And I think that is obviously a reflection of how much money they were willing to give to the NIL pot, right? So we have to acknowledge that there's not this deep pool of donors that Rutgers could keep going to get NIL. There's also not one big sugar daddy like Mike Rapoli with St. John's and the guys at Arkansas, the Tyson Foods guys at Walmart. That just doesn't exist at Rutgers. So that obviously is not helpful for Rutgers. I think it's obvious to everybody that at this point that Pat Hobbs completely botched NIL. Not only was inactive, but almost harmed these programs by almost obstructing it, right? The only things he did were checking boxes, hiring an NIL general manager who really has not done anything to no fault of his own, right? Like, I'm not sure there's an infrastructure around to help him. And he had no efforts to talk to the collectives, to talk to the people that worked at the school. Jason Belcher's a law professor that was the founder of Student Athlete NIL, a person with immense knowledge of this situation, of this new reality, just not even bothering to pick his brain, let alone use him as a resource. Again, Pat Hobbs completely botched it, and I don't want to keep, digging dirt on top of the grave. We all kind of have gone over this millions of times. That being said, to compare Greg and Steve, I think is a great way to look at this, because one was proactive. One acknowledged the reality in front of him. One did what he could to be ahead of the curve, as our example before of scouting players before they enter the portal. Proactive, preparing for this. Steve Pikiell, by the time he was at the liquor store handing out whiskey bottles with Joe Baker, or going to these Topgolf events, or even calling people. I know he called people and tried. Like, there was effort there. But if you're doing that this past summer, you're already late. Like, you're already at the point where you should be getting the players. You should have the money there. This should have been during that lost 23-24 season. It was going nowhere. Everyone knew it was going nowhere by December. That's the 2 months. Yes, you try to win the games and all that. You spend a lot more time there trying to build money. And I think there's a clear distinction between Greg Schiano's personality and Rolodex. He knows a lot more people, is a lot more personable, can sell ice to an Eskimo, as that saying goes. Steve Pikiell is just not that kind of guy. He's not a guy who's going to sell you. He's not a good salesman. That's just the truth. I know they'll say they got Dylan Harper and Ace Bailey, and he deserves credit for that. Absolutely. I think clearly, as far as raising funds, he just does not have that ability. And he was late, and doing so, and had no help.
Yep.
So,
and think about how they got to this point, though, Brian. You mentioned this, the 23-24 season, right off the bat. Like, when you lose Cam Spencer and Paul McKay, 2 guys are sort of vilified by the fan base for leaving so late. Well, why did they leave? Because they weren't getting paid. Because they already, the cracks in the foundation were already set there, right? Like, they looked around. I know the number for Cliff. Every dime that Rutgers managed to scrounge together, they gave to Cliff Omori that year. It was about $150,000 or $180,000. Whatever, it's 200,000 at the most, or in that number. When he went on the market 4 years later, he's able to get quadruple that, right? Getting 7-digit offers. It's just, and I get it. Like, they were never going to keep him. They were ready to go. That's going to be a big narrative. Cliff and Moat Mag playing each other in Newark. Both those guys were ready to go someplace else. But the foundation was never the money. The foundation was never there. The base that he needed to operate in the portal after getting Ace and Dylan here. It's just it's sad, but I think that's what I learned from your story. That's what we suspected all along, that this team was doomed from the start.
That's the thing. Watt and Cliff left within an hour of each other. They both entered the portal last offseason, right? But obviously we knew months before that they were headed there. The fact that Rutgers wasn't even in contention, maybe ultimately if the money is equal, or even Rutgers has a little bit more money to offer, those guys decide, I want a fresh start, I want to end my career somewhere else, I want to try something different. Totally fine. But the fact is the money wasn't even close. It made it the decision, not even a choice. It's a clear, obvious decision to do what they did. And it's impossible to blame them because they clearly made the right choice. But my point is that Rutgers wasn't even prepared to sit at the table to even potentially negotiate and attempt to convince them to stay. And these are two guys, you talk about retention. That's the thing missing for this program. If they were able to retain, well, those are two guys you should try to retain. You already had Dylan Harper and Ace Bailey committed. You got to get the money to retain those two guys. And if you have that as your foundation, if you have Ace Bailey, Cliff Omori, Dylan Harper, and Watt Mag, the floor for this team is so much higher. Another thing, you mentioned infrastructure, right? A lot of people were up in arms about my characterization of Rutgers as a mom and pop athletic department. A lot of anger, nobody has really told me something that has disproved that, right? Everyone's just mad about me saying it, but I think it's kind of the reality. And to connect that to a stat I had in the story, Rutgers is the 7th team, assuming nothing happens to Ace and Dylan, that will have 2 freshmen on the same roster that will get picked as top 5 of the subsequent NBA draft. They're the 7th team. The previous 6 teams won a national championship, were a national runner-up, went to Final Fours, Elite Eights. There was one of those teams that didn't make the second weekend, right? And Rutgers doesn't make the tournament. Here's the difference between Rutgers and those other teams. Kentucky, Kansas, Duke, Ohio State, athletic departments with infrastructure to handle the enormity of having a guy like Dylan Harper and Ace Bailey in your program. Right. I don't think, and this was the concern all along, Rutgers had the infrastructure or even really understood the magnitude of the season they had, the opportunity they had in front of them. I think that's clear in their lack of urgency in preparing for the season. And it's clear in after the season when we are writing about what this was objectively an enormous failure. And people are ready to move on as though they went 15-17 in Steve Pikiell's second year. That's not the reality. And to me, the fact that people are trying to blow by this is clear proof that they just don't get it.
Yeah. Pat, it's funny. The mom and pop thing is interesting because I think in some ways it's too generous. And because I think of mom and pop like it's a hardware store on the downtown that's been beaten, that despite the fact Home Depot opened a block away, it's still selling rakes. It still wins. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that's point number one. Number two, I mean, when you take the one, you bring in one guy as a lip service hire, and I don't know. I've never met Reed Zach. I don't, but you hire one guy, you say, okay, you are the NIL guy. And it's true. I mean, the image of shoving him into a utility closet, I get it. That's not where but putting him in this little office and, hey, look, we did something. And that's what I come back to with the NIL thing, which was, this was Pat Hobbs before he left. It was constantly like, well, what do you mean we're not doing anything for NIL? We have a website. Like every time I talked to him about it, it was stuff like this. Well, what do you mean? I hired this guy over here. His name's Reed. He's it was this constant thing about it where other people were working in real dollars and operating in just a different world than Pat Hobbs was. And that was him. That was really, it started with Pat Hobbs. I don't blame the people much lower. The leader sets the tone with that stuff. Yeah.
Right. The grassroots has always been there for Rutgers. And I get that. The foundation, the point that Brian started with is probably the biggest issue. That just the donor base is not what other schools in the Big Ten have. It doesn't mean that people aren't doing their job or trying to rally from a grassroots perspective, because look at what Knights of the Raritan has done. They've done a great job being a face as a collective for the program. And there's no doubt they're trying their very hardest to make it work. If that effort came down from the top, it would be a different story.
Right. Yep.
Here's what I'll say. There are a lot of well-meaning, good people that work at Rutgers Athletics. Nothing we write is a personal attack on these people. And I'm sure these people try really, really hard to do well. The reality is trying does not matter. Succeeding matters. And the reality is at 15-17 with 2 top 5 picks, there was no success. It was a failure across the board.
All right. One other thought about this, and I will say this, the other point to the story, and all that aside, all the NIL stuff aside, I do really think in looking back on this, we're still going to think, well, 15 and 17 wasn't good enough, even with the current, like it should have been better than it was with the roster. We talked about the injuries. We talked about a lot of the things, the defensive foundation, the things that just didn't click. It's just interesting to me in the aftermath. Like we're still not talking about the coaching staff in a meaningful way. Steve Pikiell's last comment, the one time he's addressed it so far, that's it. Like he hasn't done a postseason. Hey, let's reflect on what happened. Was at the podium in Indianapolis after the Big Ten tournament, and unprompted, he said, "I got to work on keeping my staff together." There's stuff like that where you're like, all right, that's going to be the answer. Like we're going to get the band back together. And that to me, it just comes back to like, he doesn't realize, like he doesn't recognize what's happening inside that program is broken on some level, because it wasn't just the talent there. There was something else. Something else was missing from the start. That team should have been better. It should have been better, even without anything else. It should have been better 15-17. I do believe that.
Probably should have won a game, one or more games. Agreed. The defense, I think, was doomed from the start with having the complete lack of a rim protector. Not even a good rim protector. They had no rim protector, and that ultimately, I look back on the numbers from the past few years. That is like the one constant in Steve Pikiell's successful defenses, having a guy who can protect the rim. They were doomed from the start there. I agree. Offensively, they could have been much better. This was their best offense under Steve Pikiell. That's because they had 2 NBA players, not because they're taking 100 mid-range shots every game. The offense didn't change. It was just having 2 guys that are infinitely better taking half of your shots. I do want to go back to one thing I almost forgot to mention. On the donor base, right? That is the truth. That has been historically the truth. That said, Greg Schiano has managed to overcome it to a certain degree. You don't get $500,000 to give to a starting safety with the no ability to overcome that issue. To me, I just don't understand how, even if you're not Jordan Belfort, you're not this elite salesman, right? How can you not find anybody and go to them and say, we have 2 NBA players for the only time in the history of the program. You love Rutgers basketball. You want Rutgers basketball to succeed. We need you to give me $2 million, and I could take your beloved Scarlet Knights to the Final Four. How could they not find one person or 2 people or 3 people or 4 people? They sell the friggin' 8,000 stadium place out for 78 straight times. Apparently, they have this huge fan base. They're always thinking they couldn't find one guy. And I know it sounds easier than I'm making it sound. $2 million is a lot of money. I get it. You couldn't find 1, 2, 3, or 4 guys. We're not asking for $20 million. $2 million for a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I can get all the explanations I'm given. That just does not click to me. You couldn't find one person.
Yeah,
I don't buy that.
That's great. Great point. All right, and this is a question that came up that I wanted that you actually said you stole from the 24/7 board. Would you have traded Ace Bailey for Cliff, Mag, and Woolfolk? Was the deal? And I read that. It's funny. Like, that's a great question. Except, I mean, the answer to that question is an obvious yes for me. Would you have traded Ace Bailey for Cliff straight up? Is a better question. Because I mean, I don't know, Pat. Am I wrong? You're going to take. I get it. He's an elite scorer, but you're going to give me the rim protector I need, the perimeter player, and the guy who can knock down a 3 and a body and a decent body inside. I'm taking that deal immediately.
I think of no. I'm taking Ace Bailey from this perspective.
You're taking Ace Bailey.
I'm taking Ace Bailey. Look at all these great games in the NCAA tournament. There's always one guy that makes the shot or scores 35 points. Cliff Amore is not doing that.
Well, Dylan Harper's doing it though. You already have the other guy. That's fascinating.
Maybe.
I thought it was
but no, I'm still taking the guy that is going to do what Derek Queen did: travel and make the basket.
Gather stuff. So the question is, I thought it was fascinating when I read it, and it's been boggling in my mind, right? Are we getting the Mawat Mag that's at BYU that's shooting 41% on threes? If you get Pat Mawat Mag, you trade him straight up for I mean, that's crazy. Are we getting the best Mawat Mag Cliff at Rutgers for Ace Bailey? And 2, more importantly, are we saying that it's just straight up and you keep the rest of the roster the way it is? Or are you saying that you trade for them at the beginning of the offseason and then you could build a roster?
No,
because
that's straight up. You're trading those players.
I think ultimately the floor of this team would get higher if you bring Cliff and Mag. I think the ceiling is a lot lower, right? Like I think that team would be able to get to the NCAA tournament. I think there would be almost no hope of going beyond the second round. Whereas
sign for that. My God.
Yeah, but if you have Ace Bailey and Dylan Harper, like yes, they didn't make the tournament because they botched the season. But in theory, you have those two to start. The ceiling is so much higher. Just because they didn't realize the potential that was there doesn't mean it's not infinitely higher with those two than Cliff and Meg.
All right. Let's talk real things happening. The portal is open. Nobody's in it other than a couple other walk-ons at this point, right? I mean, what is going on with that?
It's 10:25 on Tuesday morning. It's been 26 hours since the portal opened, roughly. That's actually wrong. 34 hours. And nobody, scholarship players from Rutgers, have been in the portal. I was in the APC yesterday for the gymnastics programs reveal. I saw Lathan Somerville in the building. Does that mean he's staying? Does that mean he's going? Who knows? He could easily be going to study, to go practice, to go to compliance, to fill out his transfer paperwork. I have no idea. Well, what I do know is that there's been no movement either way. Rutgers has reached out to a couple guys that are in the portal, right? You never know if these are just interest calls. You got to call these guys in the first place to even be in the race. So no telling where any of those things are going to go. But all we know is that, again, as of 10:26 on Tuesday morning, nobody other than Peter Noble, who led the team in three-point percentage last year, let's not forget, and Nate Fleischer, a freshman from Ann Arbor, are in the portal.
The flip side of that, people coming in, we have no idea at this point, right? I mean, it's too early to tell who they're targeting in the portal. A lot of talk about the NJIT kid.
Yes. So he's a natural. If Rutgers is going to keep its staff together as is kind of trending that direction, as Steve Peichel indicated he wanted, Tariq Francis is like one of the most obvious targets they have. He is a close family friend of Brandon Knight. He calls him his uncle. It's his mentor. He said he loved him in a story I found yesterday. Like, that's a guy who, talk about connections. You know, Brandon Knight got 2 5-star players to Rutgers through connections. Tariq Francis would be another example of a high-scoring guard you bring to Rutgers. Again, if Brandon Knight is still there, I haven't seen really much connecting Brandon Knight to other head coaching jobs. I think this is a tangent, but it's interesting to see, had this season gone the way we thought, right? Steve Peichel probably would have been a legitimate candidate at Villanova. Brandon Knight probably would have been a legitimate candidate at a lot of other schools. And again, Steve Peichel's buyout would be halved because Pat Hobbs is no longer the AD. So that would be a really interesting scenario that obviously is not going to play out. But anyway, Tariq Francis is clearly the most obvious target. I think we still have to speak in hypotheticals. I think I wrote yesterday, there's 3 clear things this team should target. A rim protector. I don't think you can go another year without a rim protector. That would be absolute malpractice. Whether they get one or not, I don't know. But with revenue sharing, you have enough money that even if you pull all your resources in that, you have to get a rim protector. A point guard. You need a guy to play point guard. Dylan Harper's obviously leaving to the NBA. I don't think you could trust any of Jay Will or JaMychal Davis or even Jordan Durkak to be your point guard. You're just going to put yourself in a really bad position if that's your starting point guard. And you need at least 1 3-point shooter because 5 of your top 6 3-point shooters are either graduating or going to the NBA. I think JaMychal Davis is your best returning 3-point shooter. Not exactly a great sign. So they have right now 4 spots to fill, or I should say 4 open spots. Obviously, there's going to be more with the transfer portal activity. I don't know. You guys, I'll say 2 over-unders for you. Over-under 3.5 guys transferring and over-under 4.5 transfers in.
I don't know. It's tough. I really don't. I don't have a great feel for it. I think 3 is about the number for, I would say, for transfers. So I'll go under. Bringing in, I think I think you're gonna go over.
So 5?
Yeah, I think you need, and I'm not talking they're all going to be high profile guys, right? They're not all like, but you're going to bring in a new team essentially. So yeah, I think 5 would be, yeah.
Yeah, I would say under on transfers out. Mm-hmm. I'll go under on transfers in too, just to switch it up and be a little different. But I think at the end of the day, the guys that are there need like the retention of that freshman class. Can't lose them. That's like the bottom line, right? Like, so there's got to be good development around those guys, and we'll see from there.
All right. Let's really
quick. I think the most important thing is the guys that are coming in. I think the floor that could the worst case scenario for this team is they have a Seton Hall year from last year. And I think the only way to mitigate that is if you improve yourself through the portal. No matter who is staying, right? I think the floor is kind of low. No matter if they bring back everybody, you need to accentuate the roster through the portal. You have to get hits. You cannot afford many duds. You have to get at least 2 or 3 guys who are Big Ten starters.
All right, let's we got 2 more teams to talk about, Pat. We got a lot of questions, a lot of disappointment about the wrestling performance in this. 0 All-Americans for a team that we thought was going to be his best, maybe his best. Clearly was not. What happened?
I've been trying to come up with a scenario to explain, to put this all into perspective of how this relates to the general big picture of disappointment. Rutgers did not have an All-American for the second time in 3 years, and 3 guys were 1 match away from becoming All-Americans, right? So 3 guys were right there. If they win 1 match, they're All-Americans. And maybe it's like window dressing. It covers up what ultimately happened. And the way I explain it, and all the people that get on Coach Scott Goodell for not taking the next step, or they're stuck and all these things, like what I think, I go back to Seton Hall under Kevin Willard. Would you take a team that was going to be there every year and maybe have a special season every now and then, or would you have Seton Hall now, given everything that's happened, a team that can just completely crash? That is never going to happen under Coach Scott Goodell, and I think he deserves so much more credit for building a program that is just going to be relevant every year, right? And you can nitpick and maybe like things aren't great, but I come back to I still think he's done a tremendous job and should be applauded for what he's done at Rutgers.
So Rutgers is a program where they should expect this stability, and then every blue moon, for example, the Schiano.
Exactly.
That one special.
You have a year, you have 2 national championships, and we label it as the greatest year in Rutgers wrestling history. That's amazing.
Yeah, I come back
that was 5 years ago.
I tend to agree with you. It's just, when I look at what's going on inside that built, there's going to be a new athletic director, and Scott Goodell is going to be like his 17th thing he's going to worry about. That's what I come back to.
Exactly.
And
exactly.
Although I do agree with people who are frustrated. I mean, obviously, something's not quite clicking there.
They've built a really good program. They were ranked number 11 in the country this year. They had a top 10 win. Right.
Just haven't taken the next step. Yeah.
They just,
so is that,
and they were there, right? Like Dean Peterson gave you this, we were talking about amazing moments for Vanderbilt beating Alabama. Dean Peterson beat a national champion in the quarterfinals and ultimately flamed out from there. But that moment was for 30 seconds, the greatest thing for Rutgers wrestling since Soriano and Ashland. It was the cover photo on NCAA.com, right? Dean Peterson of Rutgers. So I think it's very reactive, and in the big picture, things are really for a program at Rutgers that's just been good. I understand the frustration. They still have a great product, and Goodell's done a really good job.
This would be and this is a bit of an exaggerated example, but follow me. This would be like if Steve Pikiell's program had continued that momentum when they were good. They kept making it to the NCAA every year. They kept losing in the first round, maybe second round. You threw out an Elite 8, one of those years, and they just did that for 15 years.
Yeah.
At some point, people would be like, well.
Right. Yeah. They got Fran McCaffrey fired at Iowa.
Exactly. That's a great one. That's the great one.
All right. Women's NIT, let's go move there because we're already at an hour. And I just want to talk about it really quick because I think it's remarkable that there's a chance 2 things might happen: that Rutgers could win the women's NIT after going 11-19, could play 4 home games in the women's NIT after going 11-19, and finish 4 games below 500 and win in that and put a bang. So my question to you is this: if that happens, because they're playing College of Charleston now, they're the only power conference team in the tournament field from the beginning, I think. I have to go back and look. If people don't understand why, it's because there's another tournament, the WBIT, Women's Basketball Invitational. That is the new tournament where all the teams like Seton Hall played in, Stanford played in it, all the teams who actually, so you're taking the 64 teams in the NCAA tournament, the next 32 are in the WBIT, and then there's this. So this is really the dregs of teams that would say yes. Rutgers said yes inexplicably to agree to play in this thing, but they might win. And my question to you guys is this: if they win, should they hang a banner?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Oh,
absolutely.
They did win it.
It has some name recognition. It'd be like a good stamp on a postseason championship. Hang it up.
This is the CBI of women, just to make a comparison to men. RIP the CBI. As a point of honor, as philosophically, I say absolutely not. There's enough banners up there, enough token banners hanging from the rafters of the rack that you don't need another one. But Rutgers is paying to be in this competition. They're losing money by playing in these games. So the sunk cost
700 fans. They're losing money hand over fist, I'm sure, right?
So the sunk cost to me is if you're already paying to host these games and losing money, you hang a banner to at least acknowledge it.
Here's my idea, and I'm going to end it on this note. They should hang the banner in the same utility closet where they put the NIT, the NIL staff. Boom! Politi with the mic drop. Oh, you're going to say something else. Go ahead. You're dying.
As a matter of record, just to be factually correct, he is not in the electrical closet. His office is next to the electrical closet. Okay, let's be accurate.
Crouch behind some cords.
Circuit board.
Like every now and then power goes out. It's just because the guy stood up awkwardly and his arm caught a cord. Circuit board. Every time, yeah. There's it's a fuse box at the rack because that's how old the building is.
It's funny that you mic dropped a boom after a controversy existed on Twitter between Scott Goodale.
Oh, we didn't even talk about that.
And Pikel.
No. We got
so there's that one.
That's great.
Boom.
What was your take on that, Boo? What was your take on that little
you got to compete?
A little subtweet. He was not subtweeting Pikel. I assume he was subtweeting.
He came out and said it had absolutely nothing to do with
Pikel, right?
With Pikel,
he didn't say it has
yes,
basketball though.
Did
he?
I'm not sure.
He did not.
Not sure.
It was very clearly about the basketball situation because if it was about wrestling, he would just say that was not a tweet having anything to do with Rutgers basketball. He said specifically that has nothing to do with Coach Pikel. Clearly was a dig at the players to play. Yes.
Right. No,
Steve Pikel and Scott Goodale are close. I'm sure they talked about the situation.
Absolutely.
And I'm sure as a wrestling guy who believes in competition, he felt the urge. And listen, let's be frank here. Scott Goodale is not the most polished, filtered guy on social media. He says what he thinks. And what he thought was these guys should have voted to play yes. When someone tried to say it was a shot at Coach Pikel, he clarified. And again, he could have clarified and said, no. This is about the high school tournament I'm at, or this is about something else. He clearly said it's not about Coach Pikel. So if it's not about Coach Pikel.
Yeah, this is no mystery. Like Steve Pikel wanted to play in the NIT. There's no question he wanted to play in the NIT. And I'm willing to bet, and I don't know what happened. This is complete conjecture. I'm willing to bet the team at some point said, "Hey, let's play in the NIT." Because I heard rumblings around. I think they're going to play. I was like, really? They're going to play? And then what happened? Of course, what happened is somebody around Ace Bailey and Dylan Harper said, "Are you out of your bleeping mind? You're not playing." They didn't build a team around you good enough to get the NCAA tournament. Now we want to go win the crown. We want to go win the NIT. Win the crown. No, you're not. You're protecting yourself. You're out of here. And again, I'm sorry, everyone in the world is like, "Oh, you gotta play the games. This is competition." I'm sorry, they were right. They were absolutely right to not let those two play. Could you imagine a situation where he's out against some, Colorado Tech in the NIT first round? And what happened to Juju Watkins last night? Tears his ACL playing this meaningless game. It's one thing to happen. You're trying to win a real national championship. If you're trying to win the NIT, I am sorry. Whoever made that decision is 100% right.
It would be idiotic for two top 3 NBA draft picks to play any meaningless basketball game. It would be completely idiotic, and they obviously have strong representation around them that even if they wanted to play personally would shut that down in 5 seconds. I have no doubt about that. And it would be idiotic for the program to play in the Crown, which starts before the Final Four. It's going to be 3 weeks the portal's going to be open and they're playing it. That would be the dumbest decision for a program that has so much catching up to do. And honestly,
and can't multitask as it is.
Cares?
Yes.
Who cares if they win the NIT? Right. Who cares? Or the Crown? Who cares? And listen, the whole point of this thing is to win national championships, Big Ten championships. Who cares about the NIT and the Crown?
That's going to be it. That's going to be the next email we get. Hey, fellas, how about do a podcast that actually ends? We're over an hour. Let's wrap it up there. We came in hot. We had a lot to talk about. I don't know if we're going to have a lot to talk about and podcasts coming up, but we certainly will try. Fellas, good job today. I'm exhausted. You wore me out. Thanks for listening, everyone. We'll be back eventually.